All right. Welcome to module number 5. We're going to talk a little bit about exposure in this section. Next week we'll have an exam that'll cover everything we've talked about to this date. So this is an important piece because when we talk about exposure, it's how we take the shutter speed and we connect it with the aperture, and we choose which one based on the compositional effects. But we also, when we change one, we have to change the other to compensate. Let me see if I can explain this. It's a lot harder to do when I can't be drawing on the whiteboard for you, but I think I will have some attached videos and things like that, links that you can look at that will help explain it, as well certainly as the exposure section in the textbook. Okay, so exposure. We talked about shutter speed. Which one? Do we want to freeze the action, or do we want to have some blur in the image? Maybe we take a picture and it's blurry and we can't figure out why. Maybe the shutter speed's too slow. So maybe it's an unintentional decision the camera makes that leaves us with an image that's soft or not sharp. And we want a sharp image. So this is where you start looking in the metadata of the camera to see what shutter speed it may have chosen for that particular situation and determine if that was fast enough or not. The aperture, which one? We talked about depth of field. Shallow depth of field, having a plane of focus, and that those objects that are in front or behind are out of focus, drawing our attention to exactly where the camera is focused, or the opposite, where everything in the frame is in focus. Do we need all of that information? Or can we forego the business of the background and maybe the foreground and isolate it on that part of the subject that's important? So we do have choices. It's not unlimited. We can't just pick any aperture in any lighting scenario and make a picture. There's limitations. We can't pick any shutter speed in any situation and make a properly exposed picture. There's limitations. And hopefully by now, with some of the assignments, you've discovered just how slow the shutter speed can be given the lighting situation, how fast, and the same thing with the aperture. So remember that when we're talking about shutter speeds, the full numbers, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, is longer than the fractions of a second. 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th. So we have longer and we have shorter. With the aperture, we have smaller openings, f16, f22, and then we have larger openings, f5.6, f4. And they're related, okay? And they're related. I'll get to that in just a minute. Another important part of exposure is ISO. A given ISO is the amount of light the sensor needs to make a perfect exposure. It's a sensitivity. As you change the ISO higher, the sensor needs less and less and less light to make a picture. As you take the ISO and you make it a smaller number, it needs more and more and more light to take a picture. So as well as controlling the exposure through f-stop and shutter speed, we can control the sensitivity. Okay? ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Don't worry, it won't be on a test. It's not important. It's just if you want to impress your friends. You know what ISO stands for. Okay? Remember, too much light, the image is bright or all white on the back of the camera. Too little light, the image is black or very dark on the back of the camera. Okay, so remember that. Too much, white. Too less, not enough, black. Too less. Not a very good day for my English. Okay, so exposure is basically a relationship between intensity and time. The aperture controls intensity, how much light, and the shutter speed controls time. How long is that shutter open? So as we let in a certain amount of intensity, we have to let it in for a certain amount of time to match the sensitivity of the sensor. When we change the sensitivity of the sensor, then we allow a different amount of intensity or a different amount of time. Okay? But remember, as you add more intensity, you have to add less time. As you add more time, less intensity. So I'm talking about the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed. And we're getting this idea of equivalent exposures. So again, here's a list of a normal range of apertures on lenses. Our lenses that we check out here at school are 4 to 5.6. Maybe your kit lenses are the same. They may go here to 32, maybe f45. But in each one of these full f-stops, we're either cutting the light in half or we're doubling the intensity. So when we go to f2 to we go from f2 to 2.8, we've cut the light in half. We've cut the intensity in half. Remember, these numbers are circumference measurements based on focal length. Remember back in the lens, I showed you that. So it's crazy. These numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the light gets less and less and less. Do the math. Right? It makes sense then. Or you can trust me. When we go from 5.6 to f8, cut the intensity in half. When we go from f16 to f11, we've doubled the amount of light. We've opened it up enough that twice as much light comes in for the given time. So there's the relationship between these apertures. Either we're cutting the amount of light in half as we move towards 32, or we're doubling the amount of light as we move towards f1.4. Again, your cameras may stop 2.8 f4, something like that, not going all the way to f1.4. Okay? Now down here in shutter speeds, here's a typical range of shutter speeds. Now, we know with our DSLR cameras, as we said in the last module, in shutter speeds, that it goes to 30 seconds, and over here it goes to 1/8,000th of a second. But I just put some of the middle range in here to get this point across. Okay, so here we're cutting in half and doubling for the apertures. We're doing the same thing here. As we go from a 30th to a 60th, we've cut the time in half. When we go from a 30th to a 15th, we've doubled the amount of time. All right? So there's a relationship between the apertures and the shutter speed. As you change one of these, given the same ISO, 100, 200, 400, whatever it is, as you change the aperture and make it smaller, cutting the light in half, you'll have to take the time and double it to get the same exposure. This is at the foundation of how we take control of the camera. This is at the very, very fundamental level of why we can choose a particular shutter speed and why we can choose a particular aperture to create a compositional effect that we think is going to contribute to the overall message of the photograph. All right? So understanding this relationship, understanding that we can shoot at 1/8 of a second or we can shoot at 1/125th of a second, and what would the result be, and then what would the consequence be in the aperture? Because as we went from 1/8 of a second to 1/125th, right, we're cutting the time, making the time very, very short. We would have to take the aperture and open it up a lot to allow a lot more intensity. What I like to use as an example of exposure, because they're still kind of hard getting our head around this idea of light, is if you think about taking a 1-gallon bucket, okay, and you go into your backyard. You got this 1-gallon bucket, and you got this little teeny fire hose. Little teeny garden hose. Sorry about that. The next one's going to be the fire hose. The garden hose. You take this little teeny garden hose, aperture, small, and you want to fill the bucket. You turn the water on, and you sit there and okay, the bucket's full. Turn it off. As opposed to taking a fire hose with a huge diameter, aperture, turn the water on, and the bucket fills up instantly. The goal is to fill the bucket with water. In our camera, the goal is to allow enough photons in to make a perfect exposure. So what we want to do is we want to have the amount of light coming in for the right amount of time. And so it's as simple as that. When the amount of water is reduced by a smaller hose or a smaller f-stop, it's going to take longer to fill the bucket. As we go to a larger aperture, big fire hose, it's going to take less time to fill the bucket. And it's mathematical. If you double the intensity, cut the time in half. If you cut the intensity in half, double the time. That's all there is to it. So please, please, please don't overthink this. Okay? ISO is a sensor sensitivity to light. This is how big that bucket is. This is how much light do you need to make a perfect exposure. And as I said, we can take the ISO and we can change the sensitivity. Does the sensor need a lot of light or a little light? Once we define that, then we can play with the right aperture and shutter speed combination to give it that amount of light. Okay? The lower the ISO, the more light you need to make an image. So if you're going outside and photographing at noon, there's tons of light. You can go down to a low ISO, 100, 200, and make exposures all day and be in great shape. But not at night. Right? The higher the ISO, the less light you need to make that image. So that's when you use a high ISO for low light at night, indoors, something like that. Now, how high is high and how low is low, we'll get into that later, all right? But just understand that the ISO, right, controls basically the size of that bucket. How much water do we have to, what's the size? Is it a gallon bucket or a 5-gallon bucket or a half-a-gallon bucket? How much light do we need to make an exposure? And then we play with the intensity and time. Make sense? Okay. So we have this thing called basic daylight exposure. And this is where things get a little more confusing. So sit back, relax, take it in. It's basic daylight exposure, Sunny 16. There's all kinds of names that this is called. There's apps for your phone that help you with this. There's all kinds of videos that I'll be attaching that help you with this. All right. But understand that this is again at the foundation of exposure. Okay? So we know f16 is f16 is f16. Any lens on any camera, f16 is going to be the same. Pick a shutter speed, 125. 1/25 of a second is going to be the same on my camera as it is your camera, as it is everybody's camera in the class. 1/125 of a second is a measured time. So those are consistent. The one variable we have is ISO. We could change the ISO. Okay? So it just so happens that they've put all these numbers together in such a way that on a bright sunny day, dark distinct shadows, if we take whatever ISO we're using and substitute it for the lower denominator of the shutter speed fraction, and then we put the aperture at f16, we'll get a perfect exposure. Now, I know this is hard to kind of get your head around right now, but since ISO controls the amount of light we need, we have to factor that into the basic daylight exposure. Because if I go outside under bright sun today, right now at noon, it's going to be the same exposure as tomorrow, the next day, as long as there's no clouds. f16 is f16. 1/25 of a second is 1/25 of a second. Okay? So what's our exposure? How could we guess what the exposure is unless we lock down what the ISO is? So on a bright sunny day with dark shadows, 1 over the ISO at f16 is the perfect exposure for outside. If you go outside and it's got light gray shadows, a little hazy sun, we have to open it up a stop. 1 over the ISO at f11. Cloudy, bright, no shadows, kind of, ocean beach in the summertime up in San Francisco, 1 over the ISO at f8. As you notice, these apertures are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the light outside is getting less and less and less. Brightest at bright sun, a little bit less at hazy sun, a little bit less in cloudy bright, and even more when you go into open shade, which is underneath an overhang of a building. Then we're 1 over the ISO at f5.6. So that's how we can go out and make exposures without even having a light meter in our camera. If I go outside today, I don't even need to look at my camera. I can put it in manual. I can set whatever if the ISO is 100, I set the shutter speed for 1/100th of a second at f16. I go out and I shoot all day and every exposure is perfect. Okay? It's not because I'm extra smart at this photography thing. It's because this is how they've set it up to make it easy for us. Okay? So basic daylight exposure, sunny 16, 1 over the ISO at f16. If my ISO is 125, I'm bright sun, so it's 1 over the ISO at f16. So I take the 125, I substitute it. The ISO is not the shutter speed. I'm substituting that number into the lower denominator of that fraction. And 125 at f16 is the perfect exposure to go outside and make photographs today at noon. No clouds, bright sun. Okay? And I can use any one of these exposures. So here's 125 at f16. And if I go to f11, I'm making the aperture larger, so my time is shorter. I've doubled the amount of light, I've cut the time in half. If I go to f8, I've doubled the amount of light again, I've cut the time in half and go to 1/500. Same with 1/1000 at 5.6. Works the other direction. f16 to 22, I've cut the light in half. Because I cut the light in half, if I want these to be the same, I have to double the time. 160 at 22. If I cut the light in half again, I have to double the time. 1/30th at f32. So understand that each one of these exposures are going to give me the exact same density or the exact same exposure on that sensor. If I do an exposure at 1/1000 at 5.6 and 130 at 32, they're going to look exactly the same. Except for what? Hands, I'll choose somebody. Okay, except for what? Well, remember that 1/1000th is a very short duration shutter speed. So anything in the photograph is going to be frozen. If I'm shooting water, it's going to be frozen. Not going to be smooth. At 5.6, I'm going to have a shallower depth of field. Maybe I want that. If I go down to 1/30th at 32, 1/30th of a second is a little slower. Remember the example in shutter speeds, the rocks with the water. 1/30th of a second will give me some of that movement. But the consequence is going to be a very small opening, which is f32, which means everything's going to be in focus. And maybe that's okay, and maybe it's not. But if you understand the consequence of 1/30th versus 1,000 and f32 versus 5.6, you can make the appropriate decision on what exposure you want to use for that scene based on what you want to communicate, based on what you want that image to say. Is it supposed to be smooth and soft and relaxing and gentle? Or is it supposed to be harsh and edgy and call to action? You may make a decision based on those. But remember, each one of these will give you the same exposure. Your camera's probably going to pick somewhere in the middle on program or automatic. Because it knows, we're not going to give you a whole bunch of depth of field or very little. We're not going to give you super fast, super short. We're going to pick something in the middle. So it'll just make that choice for you. Which isn't bad all the time. Sometimes it's exactly what you want. Okay, so here's another example. Basic daylight exposure is 1 over the ISO at f16. We have ISO 125 again. But today when we go out and shoot, we got a little bit of hazy sun. Little light clouds. So we've got to give it a little bit more light to start. So our basic daylight exposure, right, with hazy sun is 125 at f11. The one prior to this was 125 at f16 because it was bright sun. Now we have a little bit less light, so we're going to open it up a stop. And guess what? Here we go. We have the same scale here, right? As we go from 125 at f11 to 250 at f8 to 1500 at 5.6 to 1000 at f4, or the other direction, 160 at 16, 130 at 22. They're all the same exposure. Exactly the same image. Same lightness and darkness. What's going to change is depth of field and motion. And what do you want to show in the photograph? So at each time we change the amount of light outside, we're going to change the relationship of f-stop and shutter speed. Either compensate for less light outside or more light. If we change the ISO, we're going to change it too. Because that's how much we need to make a perfect exposure. Total. We need a gallon of water. Or do we have a 5-gallon bucket or a half-a-gallon bucket? Okay? All right, so our cameras have different ways of metering light. Manual means you set the f-stop and the shutter speed and the ISO, and it'll take a picture. Whether you're right, wrong, too light, too dark, it doesn't care. It assumes you know what you're doing, and you're doing it purposefully. So you may want to experiment with that. Go outside, see what your ISO is, set your camera at 1 over the ISO at f16, and go make some photographs. And you'll see the proper exposure. So that's M. P for program. Right? That is an automatic. Not the green square is really the ultimate automatic, where you can't shoot raw, the flash goes up, ISO is on auto, everything on the camera is automated and you can't control anything. That's that little green square or the green camera. In program, you can control ISO, you can control if it's a raw file or a JPEG, you can control if the flash is going to pop up or not. But it's going to pick the f-stop and the shutter speed for you. That's P for program. And then there's aperture priority, A. Okay, in Canon it's AV, Nikon it's A, which they would do the same, it'd be so much easier. And that means that you set the ISO, you pick the aperture, f16, f11, f22, and it picks the appropriate shutter speed based on how much light there is and the ISO you've set. So this gives you a way, if really what you care about is depth of field, then you can set the aperture at 22 and it'll make all the other decisions for you. You don't have to think about it. Okay, shutter speed T, or Canon it's TV. That's shutter priority. T for time. You pick the shutter speed, and it picks the aperture. So again, the camera looks at, Brian, you want to shoot at 1/1000th of a second? And you have it set at 125 ISO, I'll go find the appropriate f-stop, given how much light there is. And then you can make a picture. So it just allows you to prioritize either the depth of field or the motion control, and the camera then will choose the other part of the exposure equation. So it's a little bit quicker sometimes. Also, you have to be careful. We'll talk more and more about this as we move through the program, and if you're with me next semester, we'll continue this. But the camera meters meter light reflecting off the subject. That means it's metering light from where the camera is. So if I'm taking a picture of you and you're against the snowbank wearing a white outfit, it's going to take all of that white that's reflecting off, and it's going to give me exposure. Same thing if you're wearing a black dress on a black background. It's going to take all of that light, and it's going to give me an exposure. Now understand that the camera doesn't know that you're wearing all white or all black. It's going to take white and say, well, you know, there's a lot of white. I bet you that's more neutral. So I'm going to average that out and make it neutral. So what ends up happening is all that white becomes gray, not white. With the black, it's going, you know, it's a little dark. I don't know if that's going to be what you want, Brian. I'm going to change that. Lighten it up a little bit. So now this beautiful black dress and this beautiful black background becomes gray. Okay? So that's what a meter does, is it averages out the scene. So if you have a normal landscape, it's going to do the right thing. If you have something that's all black or all white, it's going to be confused. It doesn't know what colors it is. It's reading the light reflecting off. And it meters in a few different ways. More expensive DSLRs have a more complicated, accurate way of metering. Some of the other cameras, the camera that we check out, the D40 and 3000s, basically has spot metering, which means it'll take all of its exposure information from a teeny spot in the center of the frame. And you better hope that spot's at the right place. If it's that spot is looking at something that's black, it's going to make a mistake. So be aware that spot metering is going to meter from a very small spot in the center of the frame. General composition, do we put our important part of the picture in the center? No. So be careful. Center weighted means it's going to take the sort of center 15-20% and average that, which is pretty accurate. Or averaging the whole scene, which is another mode you can use. So the most of even the consumer grade cameras has options of how that meter is supposed to work. Usually they have either 3 of these or 2 of these, and the list gets longer and longer and longer with the more and more money you pay for your camera. And hopefully the more accurate the metering becomes. But in any case, all of our cameras are metering light reflecting off the subject. They're reflected meters. All right, so that does it for exposure. There's also some documents on this module that has a list of shutter speeds and f-stops that you can then print these pieces of paper out and use them as scales to help you understand, once you lock in an exposure, what the equivalents are on either side, or making some adjustments based on the lighting condition. Questions about this exposure and equivalent exposures will be on the exam next week. So I encourage you to watch this again, reference the textbook, make sure you watch any of the attached YouTube videos on this, and then look at those exposure scales, because those will be a big help during the exam. All right, thank you very much.